Welcome to the GroupWise Disaster Recovery 18 Disaster Recovery Mode Design Guide video. I am Stefan Fassmann, and I will be your guide today. You can find the documentation on our website. I'll be discussing how to design and test your system for business continuity during a disaster. This is more of a conceptual overview because this depends on what resources you have access to. It can take hours to properly set up a resilient system. If you do it before the disaster, you can respond to the disaster in seconds. Doing it during the disaster will take even longer. That is why proper design beforehand is important. It is up to you to figure out how to best fit GroupWise disaster recovery into your company's business continuity plan. Any kind of business continuity plan has to take into account what resources the business has available and what is actually important to daily operations and the infrastructure surrounding the business. We are going to discuss how to properly design and test a system that includes GroupWise disaster recovery. I'll be discussing designing for robustness and how to test disaster recovery mode. What GroupWise disaster recovery is designed to do is to temporarily take over the duties of your production GroupWise system while you rebuild or replace your production GroupWise system. When you click on the ambulance to enter disaster mode and change the A record on the DNS, that means the GroupWise disaster recovery server will be handling mail. That's fine and exactly what it is designed to do. But once the disaster is over, you now have two systems with different data on them. You then have to merge the data back to the production GroupWise server. How long this takes depends on how big the difference is. You can pre-migrate data while the disaster recovery server is running the show to the restored GroupWise server until it has enough to function. Then you can let the GroupWise server take over, change the A record back to the production GroupWise server, and shut down the disaster recovery mode on the GroupWise disaster recovery server. Then do the final migration of data to the production server. Then go back to operating normally. I will guide you through some common scenarios and discuss some of the options for mitigating the hazards. One of the more common scenarios we see is a GroupWise system with everything, like the domain, post office, and GUIA, on just one server, with the GroupWise client set to use the IP address of the server to connect. GroupWise disaster recovery can help in this situation if all the disaster is the POA or MTA being down. We still need the GUIA to route mail to the internet. The GroupWise disaster recovery server can replace the MTA and or POA by pressing disaster mode ambulance. And you have to have the user point their client at the GroupWise disaster recovery server so they can access their data. That's just a little clunky with having to have the users change where their clients go. But if the power supply on the GroupWise server flames out, well, that is a slightly more difficult problem. But we can mitigate beforehand with a little bit of effort. You can set up an A record on the DNS, so the clients can just keep using the same address during the disaster. And you just have to update the A record once, and all your users will have access to all their mail again. But that isn't enough. Mail isn't going to flow without a GUIA. You can move the GUIA to a separate server. GroupWise disaster recovery can then just use the GUIA since it is the same as if it were the production system. Now if you lose the production GroupWise server, switching to the GroupWise disaster recovery server is as easy as changing the DNS, A record, and pressing the ambulance buttons to activate the MTA and POA on the GroupWise disaster recovery server. However, that only helps if you lose just the production mail server. What if the plumber is working on the sprinkler system in the battery room, slips, and drops his big pipe wrench across the battery terminals, vaporizing a bunch of metal, causing the building to black out and the sprinklers to go off? Now you have a big mess on your hands. But with proper design, this can be mitigated as well. A good disaster recovery plan needs an off-site location. This can be across the campus or across the world. Remember, this is just about email. There are other critical business functions that need to be in place for successful mitigation. In a significant disaster, your users may not have access to their company standard PCs. The idea for this scenario is to provide basic communications. There are a few major functions that need to be in place in the secondary location. You'll need to have the user data. Group-wise disaster recovery can send data from a primary server to a secondary and even tertiary server. Micro Focus provides cloud services for this scenario. To provide mail flow, a secondary GUIA will allow GroupWise to fail over without your intervention when the primary GUIA fails. This requires a secondary domain to function properly. Since it is likely that in a disaster requiring the use of the offsite location, it would be a good idea to have web access enabled so they can log in from home or a hotel or a public library. A secondary DNS will allow you to change the A records needed to point your users to the proper place to reach their data. You can bind additional IP addresses to the GroupWise Disaster Recovery Server. That way, it will be able to run multiple post offices simultaneously. Depending on the hardware, it might be slow, but it will allow your users to communicate. In a disaster, having any communications at all is a big deal. There are two kinds of tests you need to do for disaster recovery mode: data and mail flow. A data test is very simple. Activate disaster recovery mode and point the client at the disaster recovery mode POA. You can easily tell if data is available. You can do this at any time as it has no effect on production. A mail flow test is more involved, but is really important. This requires taking the production servers offline and running off the secondaries for a short time. You need to do this to make sure that the DNS, firewalls, routers, and so on are all configured properly so mail will flow. This is far more involved, but we recommend that it be done once per year. The next step is for you to take what you have learned and apply it to your network before something happens.